Okay, so by now we're all familiar with the infamous short that everybody hated on. Well, by the end of this video, you'll understand the horsepower gain and how it went from this to this. But before we dive in, you guys know the drill. Like, subscribe, and make sure to drop a comment down below. So the design is done. We've got our system. You heard it a little bit, and unfortunately, while we were trying to record this sound, we were kind of blowing some of the gain out on the sound recorders, but don't worry, we're gonna have that handled in this video. Even though the system looks like all the pipes are there, functionally it's all there, we still got some housekeeping stuff that we've got to take care of in order for this thing to really do it all. And I'm going to take you through some of those challenges we're actually going to be facing. First off, we've got that valve, the 3.5-inch valve. And what we're noticing right away is we've got a little bit of a cant on here. And as you can see, it's not very straight inside there. That's an easy fix. We've got this adjustable rod, and that's going to allow us to move it. But unfortunately, what was going on was as the exhaust would rev up, the actual force from the exhaust was pushing against here. Now, the factory system has two valves that are actuated via vacuum, which is allowed a solenoid control valve that is determined by the engine computer when and how that activates. A lot of it has to do with the input, which mode you're in. And that functionality is going to stay there, but we'd also like to add an additional layer of functionality that gives the owner complete control of the exhaust system so he can have it open whenever he wants. That's going to be a little bit tricky to implement. Now you might see these wires laying up here. And I told you guys that this system really had it all, including the catalytic converters. Now, we buried the catalytic converters inside there in order to heat the cats up themselves to keep them nice and warm, to make sure they're still functioning right. But a big challenge with this car is the placement of the oxygen sensors. We've got to try to keep them close to the cat, but the post-cat sensors, it's not 2 on this car, it's 4 on this car, meaning that we need to have bank-to-bank registering for the sensors with 2 on each bank, 4 sensors in this section of piping. Now, we could just take the stock sensor, which originally went in this area here. This is one of the connectors for it. And you can see the length of it won't quite reach to where we've got it now. So you might say, let's just lengthen the wires. Now, that would work, but being that I've been doing this for a number of years, lengthening wires isn't always the easiest way to make sure you have no issues, no problems. Anytime, regardless of how good you're soldering, you always have a chance of running into a higher resistance value from running the wires that you might not catch right away, and that might become more problematic later on down the road as the car's driven, as the car's used, as the wires vibrate and shake, move around, that you can run into an issue. So it's always best if you just have a longer sensor to begin with. But how do you get a longer sensor for a Lamborghini Aventador? Well, I'm going to go over that. So the big limiting factor is we need the same type of sensor on here. A lot of times oxygen sensors have different connectors, different wiring pinouts. We need something that is going to fit right in or can be easily modified and leaves us enough length to reach where we want to reach. So where I start off with research is, first thing you're going to look at are the numbers on the oxygen sensor body. Now, the first number that is the most important is that it says VWAG, Volkswagen Audi Group. That means this is not a Lamborghini specific sensor. With that known, we're going to assume that this is a Volkswagen connector, which I know because we do a lot of Volkswagens here and I've seen this connector before. It's in use on a lot of vehicles. Now, referencing the part number is not really going to help us because the part number on there is really just going to refer to this sensor in this length and this configuration. So I'm looking for any other number I could see on here that I'm going to cross-reference on Google to try to see if I can find the same sensor body, the actual sensor that it uses, and then I'm going to work backwards from there using Google Images. So the idea would be to type in some of these numbers, go to Google Images and start trying to see if I see a connector that looks the same and see a set of wires that looks a lot longer. This process probably took me maybe about a half an hour to kind of round something up where I found something that looked about right. And once I did, I was able to cross-reference that number and then try to find a part number for that, including the configuration for the vehicle. Now, a lot of times the sensors don't say exactly their length, and you might be able to look them up backwards through catalogs of lengths, but we as a shop have the ability to order stuff and rapidly return stuff with our various accounts and dealings that we have, which might not be the most feasible option for the people who are looking this stuff up at home. However, I was able to order a few sensors in various lengths, and I eventually landed on one that's going to fit all four of those sensors and give us the proper length without having to worry about things like resistance, if the wiring is good, if our soldering is good. We know it's going to connect in there. The wires are the same, the sensor body is the same. Again, you can see here, this is one of the sensors that we've figured out how to get it to run, and this is a solid sensor available from VW, and it should essentially work as if it was on the car from the factory. All right, so Cody's finishing adjusting the valves, running the O2 sensor wires, and now we're getting on to possibly a more challenging issue, which is adding an additional layer of control for the factory valve system. Now, the idea here would be you default into OE control, which has control for both modes, but it's not full control. There's still parameters in there that determine when it opens and closes. It's not full on-demand control when you want. The idea here would be to still switch between those two modes. We've got a product here. We've got Keller here. Do you kind of get what I'm trying to do here?
Yeah, we're gonna be able to run it how the car wants to run it, and have a remote control for when you want to turn the valve open.
As you can see, vacuum actuated. Right now we've got it hooked up to the factory system, but the idea here would be to take the vacuum line, run our box, which has an additional pump and solenoid, and attempt to have that where it would come on additionally to control this valve on its own separately. So, sounds complicated. It should be easy, but we won't know till we hook it up and kind of see. It looks pretty straightforward, Keller. What signals do you need to get that thing in there and running?
You should just need a power and ground, and then find somewhere to mount this thing.
Yeah, it's pretty big actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're gonna see if this thing actually works the way we want it to. All right, so on top of this, in order to extract the most amount of power out of this exhaust system, we're going to have to modify the ECU tune. On these cars, they're not turbocharged or naturally aspirated, so they need a bit of calibration in order to really maximize the system that we built to try to extract the most amount of power. Typically gains with a downpipe and exhaust system with the tune are somewhere in the 40 to 60 range. being that this isn't a 700, there's probably a little less there, but judging by the dyno, we'll find out where the numbers end up. But I'm a little hopeful that we're gonna see a bigger pickup with this exhaust and a finely calibrated ECU tune. Now, in order to get the ECU, Lamborghini put it inside of this wheel well up top here. So I'm gonna have to take out the front part of this fender liner in order to get at the ECU. We do not have a protocol for being able to pull the file OBD2, so the ECU needs to be pulled and it needs to be boot flashed, which is a little more intrusive. Sometimes the ECU has to be opened up depending on which model it is. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure which hardware version we're looking at until I pull that ECU down. So let's get this down and see what we're working with. Got a bunch of T27 Torx here. This would probably be a little more difficult if we didn't already have all this stuff apart. Frustrating part usually on a lot of these cars is that oftentimes, because in order to work on them, you've got to take so much apart. Going back together, there's usually a few bolts that don't quite line back up. Honestly, it doesn't even matter if it's been to the dealer or not. We've seen cars that have complete dealer service history with mismatched bolts. It's pretty common, just because there's so much stuff you have to take apart and keep track of, that it's not uncommon to see some different bolts go back in there to hold stuff up. So I've got a 10 millimeter bolt here. I've got one of these guys hanging out, smaller, already loosened up. This guy looks like it's cross-threaded in here, but that's not uncommon. We're pretty used to seeing that sort of stuff. We'll try to make it as factory as we can when we go back together, because we like to leave things better than we found it. But that being said, probably someone's been in here for something at some point. Again, pretty typical. Fender liner's out. Just got a few more 10 millimeter bolts before I can yank this guy out, but that's it. And there it is. It's a Campy ECU. This controls both banks on the V12. So we're gonna try to see if we can get this file out of here, modify it, get it back on there, get this thing on the dyno.
What's up, guys? I'm installing this exhaust cutout controller. I'm gonna hide it back there behind the airbox so it'll stay dry and stay away from heat. Run it down here, the exhaust cutout. It's gonna be teed into the original vacuum line so the car can still control it, or you can press the button and control it yourself. Great job.
So nothing is ever as straightforward as it seems. Talked about using this blue box, hooked it up, and we're having issues controlling the exhaust the way I explained. Now, there's things we like about using a controller like this. Inside we have a solenoid. We've got a sensor, a trigger, a pressure switch basically, and then we have a pump. Now, the vacuum is supplied by the computer via valve and engine vacuum. All that's good, but the main issue is if the computer's not triggering it, we can't close it at will, and we also can't open it at will. Hooking in this system can allow us to trigger it at will, but not open it at will, and I'll show you why. This is a two-way valve here. Basically, you have an in and out, and the solenoid is doing the switching between these two. So when we have vacuum applied to one, we have full control via the computer. When we close the switch, we have full control via the switch. However, there's no way to release the pressure unless we go back to the computer control, which if it's not released, it's not going to open fully. So what we need is a way to release the pressure, which would be using a three-way valve. Now, I like using this blue box the way it came, but Keller's going to tell us how he came up with trying to continue to use the blue box, but operate it a little bit differently.
So basically what we did, this valve, the two ports are connected at all times, and it has a vent on there. So when it's not energized, it'll release the vacuum. This one is just basically on and off, connecting the two. So it's never going to give you control with the computer. You would only be able to control it with this pump. So we got this one in here. Basically now we can let the car control it. Now we can control it with our own switch.
All right, so the moment of truth, we've got this thing strapped to the dyno, and we get to see if all these fancy design implementations that we've done will actually make a difference. We've got to see what kind of power it puts down. Got our stock run up here. The challenging part on this vehicle is until the car warms up, we don't have full access to the RPM limit. And getting the car hot, although gives us full access to that, it also starts to heat soak the car. So there's a fine balance between heat soaking the car to get that full limit and getting a power reading that's going to represent the most power this car could put down. So we'll probably have to try a few different ways to heat up and cool down the car, timing between runs and whatnot. But that being said, we're all ready. Here's the number to beat. Let's see what it does. All right, knocked out 2 runs, and as I thought, we were able to push out past our new rev limiter to around 8,200, a little bit higher than we initially hit. That's 45 horsepower, 50 horsepower, roughly in the, like, repeatedly in the 6,000 and on area. Some good gains below that, and I haven't even got this thing to figure out where it's going to make its best power, hot and cold wise, being that this car dynoed at 529 with a 29% drivetrain loss. That's a 740 horsepower car. If we're hitting about 570 and some change, that bumps this thing up to about an 800 horsepower car, which is pretty respectable. Let's see what else we can do. Well, our best run so far, we're hitting 570, pretty much on the dot. Peak to peak, we've got a 40 horsepower gain, but in between some of these areas, we're seeing as high as 65, which is pretty dang impressive. This thing's being a pain in the butt to try to cool down because I'll have some runs that heat soak and produce less power. So it's just a balance of getting it cool enough to produce a good number, but warm enough to not cut us off the top end with the rev limiter. But let's see what else we can do. So this thing's being a big pain in the ass, and the issue that we're having is that when I run it, the number that it is making isn't necessarily representative of the peak number it could make, because I need the car to warm up in order to unlock the max RPM limit. So if I start it cold, it's not going to unlock that till the oil temperature is nice and hot. But if I let it sit for longer than 10 minutes, it resets that rev limit down to 7,500. So if it's at 7,500, I can't make the full graph, meaning I got to warm it back up, meaning the car heat soaks again. So what I need to do is figure out a way to try to get this thing as cool as possible without resetting that limiter that's built in for the car warming up, even though the car's plenty warm. So 529 is our stock run, 570 is our best run, and you'll see that that number kind of is more or less real close to each other because I'm having to do the same thing. If I let it warm up any longer, the numbers start to fall, and if I let it cool down any longer, I have to spend more time warming it back up, which gets me back to these numbers. But I know that if I could get this thing to cool off for about 15, maybe 20 minutes, and then run it, I'm probably gonna see a really good number, but it's very difficult to do. But I think I just stumbled across a way to get this thing to cool down. Basically, instead of turning the car back off to cool down, you let the car cool off with the key on. It doesn't look like the rev limiter resets as fast, and it holds it where it's at. So I'm gonna give that a try after about 15 minutes of cooling, which normally would reset it, meaning I'd have to start it again, let it warm up for about 3, 4, 5 minutes, which is putting heat back into it, which is gonna dip that number. I might be able to bypass that, start it up, run it, and see what this thing really puts out. Let's try it out. Just as I thought, getting this thing cooled, we went a little longer, about 17 minutes. Had the fans on top of those intake manifolds. And yeah, this is kind of what I expected to see because the car just felt like it was pulling really good, and it could if it was cooler, but we were just putting too much heat into there. And when we get it cool, the way that fans in this dyno room wouldn't, running down the road with hundreds of miles an hour of air running into the engine, running across the bonnet, running across the coolers. We're seeing a number more representative of what I feel like this car is making, which is nutty. That is a 70 peak horsepower gain. And geez, in some areas, this might be 80, 90 wheel across the board with a tune and an exhaust. This is pretty astounding. Now, we've been taking slow shots. Donnie noticed something while this thing was running. He said that when he saw one of the flames come out, he noticed it was spinning. So hopefully we caught that. We can catch that and show you guys. But there might be something to trying to get this thing to spin coming out as these power numbers are revealing. I'm blown away, and I'm pretty happy with where it's at. So, you know, we'll do a few more shakedown runs, but we got to get this thing back together. I've also got another Aventador for you guys to do a sound comparison on, see which one you like better. But as far as power numbers go, I think the proof is in the work.
Dude, those pops are ridiculous. Sounds like a fucking F1 car.
Yeah, F1 car, exactly.
Literally.
Big power, bigger numbers than we've seen with other available systems. Will this design be the next big thing? Well, this wouldn't be the first time one of our innovative designs has been copied by bigger name companies and peddled as their concept. We get it, we're small, but at the end of the day, we like to believe we know what we're doing. Well, maybe not when it comes to audio video quality, but with exhaust fabrication that frees up power and has a unique sound, you betcha. What do you think about the power gains? And how about the sound? Leave a comment below and let us know how you feel. Don't worry, we've got thick skin. I was proud of the work that went into this thing, but I'm even more proud of the 70 peak wheel horsepower we were able to extract from this raging NA bull. And if our customers are happy, then all I can say is mission accomplished. Thanks for watching. Share this, like, comment, subscribe, and until next time,